Hey, my friends.
The key stopped halfway in the lock and refused to go any further, like the door had already decided I no longer belonged there. I didn't force it. I never force things that are already revealing themselves. Behind me stood my daughter, Ria, quiet in that careful way she gets when she knows something has shifted but hopes it hasn't broken yet. Her husband, Calder, leaned against the porch rail with crossed arms, owning the posture of a man who believes confidence is the same as authority. I examined the lock closely and saw clean metal, no dust, no wear, new, deliberate, installed with purpose. Calder said, I upgraded it, as if he'd changed a light bulb, not rewritten boundaries. I asked, calmly, without asking, and let my voice stay level enough to make him uncomfortable. He smiled and said, It's my responsibility now, which told me everything I needed to know about how he viewed the house and us. My wife stood slightly behind me, silent, observant, her stillness not confusion but calculation. I nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a challenge you've already solved. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Rio whispered my name like it might soften the moment, but moments like this don't soften, they crystallize. I told Calder, locks don't grant ownership, and watched his smile tighten just a fraction too late. There was a faint humor in it. Honestly, men like him always think the paperwork is finished when the noise stops. I stepped off the porch slowly, because rushing gives the wrong impression, and I wasn't here to impress anyone. As we walked away, I glanced back once, not at Calder, but at the door, already imagining it wide open again. That evening, I reviewed documents Calder had never asked about and never thought to question. By sunrise, the lock he trusted so much would be the least of his concerns. That night, I slept just fine, which always surprises people when they hear it later. They assume a man my age must lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying insults like a broken radio. The truth is simpler. Once the line is crossed, my mind gets very quiet. I made coffee before dawn and realized I'd bought the wrong beans. Again, dark roast instead of medium. A small betrayal I chose to forgive immediately. While the kettle whistled, I opened the old metal file box I keep in the garage, the one Calder never touched because it smelled like oil and responsibility. Inside were deeds, amendments, notes written in my handwriting from years ago, back when I planned for problems instead of reacting to them. People think preparation is pessimism. I've always considered it politeness toward my future self. Maris watched me from the doorway, arms folded, saying nothing, which was her way of asking whether I needed anything without interrupting my thinking. I told her he changed the lock, and she replied, I know, without looking surprised, which told me she'd already reached her own conclusions. There was a moment, brief, controlled, when the insult landed fully, not as anger but as clarity. Calder hadn't secured the house. He'd announced himself. I chuckled quietly at the memory of him explaining responsibility, because men like that love big words and hate fine print. By mid-morning, I'd made 2 phone calls and 1 appointment, none of them dramatic, all of them final. I even managed to lock myself out of the shed for 10 minutes, which felt ironic enough to deserve a raised eyebrow from the universe. Still, I never once considered confronting Calder directly. Confrontation is for people who haven't finished their homework. Instead, I reviewed timelines, access points, and one particular clause he'd never bothered to read. By noon, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, which is far more dangerous. What Calder didn't realize was that the lock he installed had started a clock he couldn't see. And once that clock started ticking, it was never going to stop on his schedule. By the third day, the house felt different even from the sidewalk, like it had learned a new accent overnight. I walked past it once in the morning, hands in my pockets, nodding to a neighbor who pretended not to notice the tension humming through the hedges. Inside, Calder was rearranging furniture, my furniture, because men like him believe moving chairs equals taking ground. I watched through the front window long enough to see him struggle with my old armchair, the one that always bites back if you lift it wrong, and I allowed myself a quiet smile. Humor, I've learned, is best served silently, especially when it's earned. I spent the afternoon at a small office across town, listening more than I spoke, because people reveal far more when you don't interrupt their confidence. There's a rhythm to paperwork when it's done right. Stamp, sign, pause, like a heartbeat Calder never learned to hear. On the way home, I stopped for groceries and somehow managed to buy everything except the one thing I went in for, which felt appropriate given the week. At dinner, Maris and I ate slowly, discussing nothing urgent, because urgency belongs to people who are already losing. I told her about Calder moving the armchair, and she said he always was bad at judging weight, which was her way of laughing without making a sound. Later that evening, Calder called, once, and left a message that sounded rehearsed, friendly, and slightly too loud. I didn't listen to it right away. I let it sit like unopened mail, gathering its own importance in the dark. When I finally pressed play, he spoke about misunderstandings and temporary arrangements, words that shrink when examined closely. I deleted the message and placed the phone face down, because some conversations are better answered by documents than voices. That night, I stood in the yard and looked at the house, measuring not anger, but distance, how far confidence can fall when it has nothing under it. I wasn't reclaiming space yet. I was letting him believe the silence meant acceptance. Men like Calder always confuse quiet with permission, and that mistake ages very poorly. The next step required Calder to make one more assumption on his own, and by morning, he was going to make it eagerly. On the fourth morning, I drove past the house again, not to look at it, but to confirm it still believed the lie it was living under. Calder's car sat in the driveway crooked, half over the line, the way people park when they think the rules no longer apply to them. I noted it the way a mechanic notes a strange sound. Interesting, but not urgent yet. At home, I tried to fix a loose hinge on a cabinet door and somehow tightened the wrong screw, which made the door open wider than before. I left it that way as a reminder that not every adjustment improves things. After breakfast, I met with someone who had known me long before Calder knew my address, and we spoke in short sentences that carried a lot of weight between them. Experience teaches you that the most dangerous agreements don't need enthusiasm, they only need precision. By noon, I had a timeline in my head so clear it felt almost polite to follow it. Maris asked if I wanted her to come with me later, and I told her not yet, because every operation has a moment when fewer eyes make better results. In the afternoon, Calder texted, asking where we'd been staying, as if we were guests who forgot to sign the book. I typed a reply, erased it, typed another, erased that too, and finally sent nothing, because silence was already doing the job better than words ever could. I chuckled to myself when my phone auto-corrected his name to something else entirely, which felt like technology quietly taking sides. That evening, I sat on the porch of our temporary place and watched the light fade, thinking about how confidence looks strongest right before it's tested. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and leaves ash, while patience builds pressure slowly and cleanly. Men like Calder don't watch for pressure, they watch for noise, and I was giving him none. Before bed, I reviewed one final document and folded it carefully, the way you fold a letter you know will be read twice. I slept well again, because certainty is a very comfortable mattress. What Calder didn't know was that by assuming we had nowhere to go, he had already agreed to what came next. And once that agreement took shape, there would be no polite way for him to undo it. The fifth day was when Calder stopped pretending this was temporary and started behaving like a landlord who'd misplaced his paperwork. I noticed it in small ways. Packages delivered to the porch without our names, a new welcome mat that said home, as if the word could be claimed by rubber and confidence. I stood across the street long enough to see him give instructions to a delivery driver, pointing at the house with a flat palm, the universal gesture of ownership used by people who have never earned it. There's a special kind of comedy in watching someone rehearse authority in front of an audience that didn't ask for the show. I went to the hardware store that morning for a screwdriver and came back with everything except the screwdriver, which felt like the universe gently reminding me to stay focused. On the drive back, I passed a billboard advertising peace of mind, and I laughed out loud, because peace is never advertised to people who already have it. Maris met me at the door and said Calder had called twice, his tone sharper the second time, like a knife learning it's not decorative anymore. I asked her if she'd answered, and she said no, because she wanted to hear how his voice would sound the third time. That was when the insult finally took its full shape. Not rage, not shock, but the quiet humiliation of being discussed, as if we were furniture someone forgot to move out. I sat down and wrote a list, not of grievances, but of facts, because facts age better than feelings and never need defending. There was a moment of dark humor when I realized Calder had installed cameras facing outward, protecting himself from the world while ignoring what was already inside the house. People who rush to secure borders usually forget to check their foundations. That afternoon, I made one visit that didn't involve the house at all, which is how you know a plan is real. When I came home, I felt something settle, not relief, but alignment, like a door finally closing without resistance. I didn't tell Maris everything. I didn't need to, because she could already see the outline of what was forming. I simply said, "Tomorrow will be louder," and she nodded, satisfied with the warning. That night, Calder made his first real mistake, one born not of cruelty, but of certainty. And certainty, when it's misplaced, has a habit of collapsing all at once. The sixth morning arrived with a kind of confidence that didn't belong to me, which is how I knew Calder had slept well. People sleep best when they believe the story they've told themselves, and Calder had been telling his loudly. I received a message from him that wasn't angry yet, just instructional, explaining what we could retrieve from the house and when, as if courtesy could be scheduled after trespass. I read it twice, not because it was complex, but because it was impressive how many assumptions fit into so few words. While I considered it, I attempted to fix the kitchen clock that's always been 5 minutes fast, and somehow managed to stop it entirely, which felt like a metaphor I didn't ask for but accepted. Maris raised an eyebrow at the frozen hands and said, "So, time finally caught up?" And I told her it was only resting. Later that morning, I walked into a public office where people lower their voices automatically, and I was reminded how useful quiet authority can be. No one rushed me, and I didn't rush them. We spoke in confirmations and dates, not emotions, and every sentence closed a door Calder didn't know existed. There was a brief moment of humor when I was asked to confirm my identity, and the clerk squinted at my photo like it was an old acquaintance who'd aged better than expected. By noon, the situation had shifted without moving an inch, which is my preferred way of applying pressure. Calder called again, this time asking, not telling, whether we planned to work something out, the confidence leaking from his voice like air from a tire. I told him calmly that we already had, and he went quiet long enough to misunderstand what that meant. In the afternoon, I stood across the street again and watched him pace, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing toward the house as if it might back him up. I felt no satisfaction watching it, just confirmation, the way you feel when a bridge holds exactly as engineered. That evening, I packed one small folder and placed it by the door, because tomorrow wasn't about thinking anymore. It was about timing. I slept deeply, not because the matter was settled, but because it was finally moving in only one direction. What Calder didn't realize was that his last message had crossed a line that turns private patience into public procedure. And once that happens, things stop being negotiable very quickly. The seventh day didn't announce itself with noise, it arrived with posture. I woke up already standing straighter, not physically, but internally, the way you do when a decision has finished ripening. I put on a clean shirt, then changed it because it felt too clean, and finally settled on one that said I wasn't here to impress anyone. Maris noticed and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that means she knows today has edges. On the drive over, I missed a turn I've made correctly for 20 years and didn't bother correcting it right away. Sometimes an extra minute helps you arrive exactly on time. Calder's car was still there, still crooked, still confident, and for the first time it looked temporary. I walked up to the porch slowly, not to the door, never the door, but to the window, where I could see him pacing inside, rehearsing a speech to an audience that had already left. He opened the door before I knocked, smiling too quickly, the way men do when they're afraid silence might win. "Let's be reasonable," he said, which is always the opening line of someone who's run out of leverage. I told him I was being reasonable all week. Today was just the paperwork catching up. There was a small, almost charming moment when his phone buzzed and he tried to ignore it, then checked it anyway, because confidence hates unanswered questions. His face changed, not dramatically, just enough, when he realized the message wasn't from me or Delaney. I stepped back from the threshold deliberately, making space, because pressure works better when it doesn't crowd. Behind him, I could see boxes stacked near the hallway, the first physical sign that certainty had cracked. He asked where Maris was, and I said, watching, which was true in more ways than he understood. I didn't raise my voice or explain myself. Explanations are for people who still think this is a debate. As I walked away, I tripped slightly on the edge of the step. Not enough to stumble, just enough to remind myself that even controlled exits don't have to be perfect. I smiled at that, because perfection has never been my goal, resolution has. By evening, Calder was making calls he never thought he'd have to make. And somewhere between those calls, the house quietly began returning to its original owner, without asking his permission.
I watched the house from the passenger seat, not with longing, but with assessment, the way you look at a place that has temporarily forgotten who raised it. People assume mothers react first and think later, but experience teaches you the opposite. Thinking is how you keep your balance. Calder had curtains open in rooms he never used before, a small sign of territorial confidence that felt almost sweet in its ignorance. I noticed the lawn hadn't been watered properly. He turned on the sprinkler and forgot it, flooding one side while the other stayed dry, which told me exactly how he handled responsibility. When my husband said nothing on the drive, I knew he was already 10 steps ahead, and I smiled because silence between us has always meant alignment. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat, not because it was cold, but because appearance matters when people are about to misjudge you. Delaney wasn't there yet, which was intentional on our part. Parents shouldn't be rescued by their children, not at this stage of life. Inside, I could hear Calder moving quickly, opening and closing drawers like answers might be hiding in the wrong places. There's a quiet humor in watching someone search for control where it never lived. I checked my phone and realized I'd left my glasses in the car, which forced me to rely on memory instead of detail, and memory has never failed me. The smell in the house was wrong, new detergent over old wood, like someone trying to erase a history with fragrance. I stood still long enough for Calder to notice me without me announcing myself, and his shoulders tightened before he even turned around. That moment told me everything. He hadn't expected resistance to have a face, much less a calm one. I didn't greet him. Greetings imply equality, and we were past that illusion. Instead, I asked one quiet question that carried more weight than a lecture ever could. Calder answered too quickly, and people who answer too quickly always reveal more than they intend. By the time Delaney arrived, the atmosphere had already shifted in a way no apology could reverse. Delaney arrived 10 minutes later than planned, which told me she had argued with herself in the car the whole way over. She stepped inside cautiously, eyes moving between her husband and the walls, as if the house itself might take sides. I touched the edge of the dining table with my fingertips and felt the faint grit of unfinished cleaning, a small detail that made me oddly calm. Calder began explaining again, using longer sentences this time, which is what people do when short ones stop working. I let him talk, because men like him mistake patience for approval, and I wanted him comfortable enough to misstep. There was a moment of unintended comedy when he knocked over a stack of mail while gesturing, then bent to pick it up and dropped half of it again. I said nothing, but Delaney noticed, and the look on her face shifted from loyalty to recognition. I finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, asking Calder to explain how he'd come to believe the house answered to him. He referenced effort, upgrades, and responsibility, words that sound impressive until you ask who authorized them. I nodded slowly, as if considering his logic, while mentally counting how many of those arguments had already expired. When I mentioned the documents my husband had prepared years ago, Calder froze just long enough to confirm he'd never seen them. Delaney asked what documents, and I watched her realize there were entire conversations she'd never been invited into. I allowed myself one small smile when Calder suggested compromise, because compromise is what people offer when leverage is gone. The house felt quieter then, as if it were listening again instead of being spoken over. I checked my watch and realized I'd put it on backward that morning, which felt fitting. Calder's timeline was reversed too. I told Delaney we'd talk later, just the two of us, and she nodded, relief and fear arriving together. Calder tried one last appeal to emotion, but emotion had already left the room. And once it does, Only facts are left to finish the conversation. By mid-afternoon, the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see who would speak next and who would finally listen. Calder tried to reframe everything as a misunderstanding, which is what people do when facts stop cooperating. I moved one of the chairs back to its original place, not to be tidy, but to remind myself how easily order returns when you stop arguing with it. Delaney watched me do it, and for a second she looked like a child again, noticing how calm can be louder than shouting. I asked Calder where the spare keys were, and he hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without saying it. There was a faint moment of humor when he checked his pockets twice, as if keys might appear out of guilt alone. I told him we wouldn't need them, which confused him more than anger ever could. Experience has taught me that confusion loosens people faster than confrontation. I opened my bag and realized I'd brought the wrong folder, which earned me a quiet, private smile. Calder mistook it for doubt. Instead of correcting the mistake, I closed the bag and said, "This will do, because certainty doesn't depend on props." He asked if we were threatening him, and I answered honestly, "No, we were concluding something." Delaney flinched at that word, not because it was harsh, but because it was final. I explained, carefully, that living somewhere and controlling it are not the same thing, and that time doesn't convert permission into ownership. Calder laughed once, short and brittle, the kind of laugh people use to keep the floor from giving way under them. I stood and smoothed my coat again, not out of nerves, but because moments like this deserve composure. When I told him to start packing what was truly his, the house seemed to exhale for the first time in days. That evening, Calder made a call he never imagined making from that living room. And with that call, the balance shifted from argument to inevitability. By evening, Calder's confidence had thinned into something brittle, the kind that cracks when touched too carefully. He began sorting items on the kitchen counter, separating what he believed was his from what he suddenly wasn't sure about, and that uncertainty did most of the work for us. I watched without hovering. Hovering suggests worry, and I felt none. Delaney tried to help him, then stopped midway through folding a sweater when she realized she didn't know where it belonged anymore. There was a quiet, almost comic pause when Calder asked if a lamp was part of the house, as if ownership might be clarified by lighting. I told him to take what he brought with him and leave what answered to the walls, which seemed fair enough to confuse him completely. My husband stood near the doorway, silent, present, the way a judge stands when the verdict no longer needs explaining. I noticed Calder avoiding eye contact with the family photos, as though faces could testify if given the chance. When he reached for a drawer he hadn't opened before, it stuck, and he tugged too hard, spilling contents onto the floor. I offered him a small box for the loose items, not out of kindness, but because dignity is easier to carry when it's packed properly. Delaney looked at me then, really looked, and I could see her understanding arrive without asking permission. I reminded her gently that homes remember who protects them, even when people forget. Calder tried one more time to argue timelines, expenses, effort, all the things that feel important right up until they aren't. I listened until he finished, then said nothing, because silence is very persuasive when it's earned. The house felt steady again, like furniture settling after being moved back where it belongs. As they carried boxes toward the door, I realized I'd left the oven light on all day, which felt appropriate. Clarity often comes from seeing things too clearly for too long. Outside, neighbors paused their routines just long enough to notice the shift. And Calder finally understood that this was no longer a disagreement, but a departure. The night air cooled quickly, and with it, Calder's certainty finally lost what little warmth it had left. Boxes lined the walkway like a poor imitation of progress, each one revealing how little of the house truly belonged to them. Delaney stood between the porch and the driveway, unsure where to place herself, which is always the hardest space for an adult child to occupy. I told her calmly to step inside for a moment, not to choose sides, but to remember where she learned how doors work in the first place. Inside, I noticed Calder had replaced one of the light bulbs with the wrong wattage, too bright, almost harsh, and I switched it off without comment. He watched me do it, confused, as if the house had taken my side without asking. There was a brief, oddly funny moment when one of the boxes split open at the bottom, sending a scatter of items across the lawn, and Calder froze, unsure whether to kneel or pretend it hadn't happened. I handed him a roll of tape from the garage because endings don't need cruelty to be complete. My husband leaned against the doorframe, arms relaxed, watching the scene with the patience of a man who knows the final page has already been written. Delaney whispered that she didn't think it would go this far, and I told her it hadn't gone far at all. It had simply reached the truth. She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means something painful has finally made sense. Calder tried to speak again, but his words trailed off, defeated not by argument, but by the absence of any remaining audience. I reminded him, gently, that changing locks doesn't change history and claiming space doesn't create roots. The house stood quiet behind us, restored not by force, but by recognition. When the last box was loaded into the car, I realized Calder hadn't once looked back at the windows. People only look back when they believe something might follow them. As the car pulled away, Delaney remained on the porch, caught between relief and loss. And I knew the real test wasn't over yet, it was simply changing its shape. The driveway emptied faster than I expected, and silence rushed in to fill the space Calder had been occupying with noise and certainty. Delaney stayed standing where she was, arms folded, staring at the spot where his car had been, as if the ground itself might explain what just happened. I didn't rush to her. Rushing suggests rescue, and she didn't need rescuing anymore. Instead, I walked back into the house and began opening windows, one by one, letting the evening air push out the stale confidence that had settled into the walls. There was a small, almost absurd moment when one window refused to budge until I realized I was turning the latch the wrong way. Control, even now, requires attention. Delaney followed me inside slowly, like someone returning to a place that feels familiar but no longer unquestioned. She asked if we hated him, and I answered honestly that hate is loud and exhausting, and we don't waste energy on things that have already removed themselves. I told her that what happened wasn't punishment, it was correction, the kind that restores balance instead of tipping it further. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one she did homework at years ago, and for the first time that night, she looked smaller, not weaker, just humbled. My husband brought in a glass of water and set it in front of her without comment, because care doesn't always need words to be understood. There was a faint, dry humor when Delaney noticed the welcome mat outside was upside down, something Calder must have done in his hurry, and she let out a short, embarrassed laugh. I told her to leave it that way for the night. Reminders don't need fixing immediately. She asked if things could ever go back to how they were, and I told her calmly that nothing goes back. Things either grow up or fall apart. The house felt settled then, not victorious, but steady, like it had finally been allowed to exhale. As I turned off the lights, I realized I'd been carrying my handbag all evening without setting it down, and I laughed quietly at myself. Old habits die hard, especially the useful ones. Before bed, I stood in the hallway and listened, not for footsteps, but for certainty, and found it waiting exactly where I left it. What Delaney didn't know yet was that tomorrow would bring a choice she couldn't avoid. And this time, no one would make it for her. Morning arrived quietly, the way it does after something has finally settled into its proper place. Sunlight moved across the hallway walls without hesitation, no longer interrupted by uncertainty or borrowed confidence. Delaney came down the stairs slowly, not cautiously, but thoughtfully, like someone who understands that today requires honesty more than speed. She said she hadn't slept much, then stopped herself and corrected it. She had slept enough to know what she needed to say. I made coffee and accidentally used the larger scoop instead of the small one, which resulted in a brew strong enough to command respect. I left it that way because this wasn't a morning for dilution. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had seen arguments, laughter, and silence over decades, and none of it felt wasted. Delaney spoke first, not to defend Calder, not to accuse us, but to admit she had confused convenience with loyalty. I didn't interrupt her. Clarity deserves room. When she finished, my husband nodded once, not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that she had finally spoken as an adult. I told her she was welcome in our home anytime, but no one would ever speak for it again without our consent. There was relief in her eyes, not because she'd been forgiven, but because the rules were clear again. We walked through the house together, opening doors, checking rooms, restoring small orders that had been disturbed, and the process felt almost ceremonial. At one point, my husband tried to rehang a picture and placed it slightly crooked. We both noticed and decided to leave it that way, a quiet reminder that perfection was never the goal. By midday, the lawn was empty, the porch was ours again, and the lock turned smoothly, obedient to the right hands. Delaney hugged us before leaving, a real hug, not the kind given out of obligation, and I knew she understood the difference now. When the door closed behind her, the house didn't feel lonely, it felt whole. We didn't win by shouting or chasing anyone away. We won by standing still, holding our ground, and letting the truth do what it always does when given time.